Before we get into that though, when we talk about the impact of dating on development, like is this something that's healthy for adolescents to do? Is it something that's problematic? Yes, you're going to find mixed results. One of the findings that seems to be found time and time again is that if you are engaging in mixed sex group activities, so this doesn't have to be full-fledged dating, but like I was talking about with a group of 12-year-olds all hanging out together and uh, maybe somebody's dating, but you can't necessarily tell. This actually has a positive impact on well-being. This is going to be the case for younger adolescents and middle adolescents as well. It's pretty status enhancing. Basically, you feel good about yourself if you're engaging in these more adult-like behaviors. And other people outside of your group may think, wow, that's really cool that you're not like let's say it's a group of girls, like, oh, you're hanging out with boys. So this can actually have an positive impact on your well-being. When we talk about timing, people who are really early to the dating world and people who are later to the dating world can both be at risk, but context really matters here. For individuals who start dating early, and so for females, this is younger than the age of 15. And what I'm saying here is not just like loosely dating or these group activities, but getting into more serious relationships at a really early age is kind of what we're talking about here. We tend to see that they are, early dating is associated, again, this is for females, with less maturity, lower achievement, or lower achievement oriented. They're less happy with their self in terms of their identity and their looks, and they tend to be more depressed. This is on average, right? So this isn't saying that if this applied to you if you started dating young, but part of this is because when we're talking about identity development and individuals who start dating really young and this is dating seriously really young, may start to identify within the eyes of those partners. Even if that partner is a good partner, as any 14-year-old boyfriend would be, but nevertheless, it could affect how you are developing. For late bloomers, if we're looking at outcomes, it really depends on why someone is a late bloomer. So not all late bloomers are equally as negatively affected. So is it because are you delaying dating because that's what's culturally normative? So just like I was talking about on the last slide, what's expected from you. And so if dating is taboo, then there's no negative outcomes associated with or little, again, what the research says, risk for that. But if the reason that you aren't dating is because maybe more of these interpersonal skills or personality traits, like being shyer than the average person, or unpopular or unattractive, and these are not my words, this is based on the research, then some of the risks it's associated with a weaker self-image and more insecurity. From a developmental perspective, it's not to say that you can't overcome these issues, but during the point of adolescence, when these are happening, this is when those risks are more likely to emerge, and depending on what that risk may be will depend how long into the future that might affect an individual. Now we're going to switch gears and talk about families. We've already talked about families in childhood. We talked about different parenting styles. We talked about attachment. Those are certainly still both at play now. With attachment, we could be talking about the shift from our attachment figure being our parent to potentially being a best friend or romantic partner. This is going to become even more apparent as we go through adolescence into older adolescence. So here I'm going to take a different approach and talk about how, families are dynamic, they're changing, and multiple players are invested in this process. When we talk about adolescence, this is a time of reorganization and change when it comes to families. As a whole, many families report less time in family activities. The adolescence, again, starts to spend more time by themselves or more time with peers more time, let's say, doing homework, more time doing after school activities, or more time in after school jobs. There's also a change in the balance of power. We've already talked about these ideas when we were talking about cognitive development. One of the main areas of change is that we start to question authority and question what we've always been told. We're also gaining decision-making skills or autonomy in adolescence, which means that adolescents may question, the rules. So there's a change in that power. And there's also potentially a change, more conflict. So an adolescent may view the family rules differently or expect more freedom. They see themselves differently. They see themselves as more mature. And not to say that they aren't, but it's just, again, this is a time of conflict. So it's this interesting theory that I find particularly compelling, and it's called family systems theory. And this is the idea that relationships broadly change when a member or family circumstances change. So the way that you can think about this is that it's at various points in our lives, our families are kind of at an equilibrium or like a homeostasis, just like normal functioning. But then someone changes. It doesn't have to be the adolescent. I'm going to talk about the adolescent here, but it could be anybody. Somebody goes through some bigger change. Maybe there's an illness, physical or mental health related. Maybe there's a divorce or a marriage. Maybe there's a new baby. Um, Regardless, what's happening here is that in the study that was done on family interactions, that when we look at when are the times of equilibrium most likely to change. And in this particular study of families, they found that this equilibrium is more likely to be upset and is more common around the ages of 13 and 14 in boys or 11 and 12 in girls. What's happening at these times? Hopefully you're thinking puberty. Puberty is changing, or a big change. And so what's happening is that during this time of puberty, the family is undergoing a huge shift, a time of reorganization and change. But I want to make this super clear, and we're going to see on the next few slides why this is the case. When we are seeing that these pubertal changes are causing a disruption to the equilibrium, it's not the case that adolescents are the only cause of this. We really do have to consider the whole family and how the whole family is changing and adjusting. In the next slides that follow, I'm going to talk about more specifically just the parents, but siblings are also going to play a role in here too. Just keep that in the back of your mind. Now, one thing to consider is that parents are also going through changes or potentially could be going through changes at the same time that puberty is taking place, or puberty and then the period after that. So one thing that we could talk about is parents' own, I don't want to use the term midlife crisis, but midlife changes. And we'll definitely talk about that more when we get to the adulthood section of this course. So let's say that somebody has their first child around the age of 30, which is really, really common. And this means that they're in their early 40s when adolescence actually begins. We will talk about, again, identity crises when we get to adulthood and to see how common these actually are. But even if you don't have a full-blown crisis, this doesn't mean that, let's say, starting in your 40s, for some individuals, it could be younger. For some people, it could be older. For some people, it doesn't happen at all. But this could be a time where parents are having their own kind of issues. So perhaps they are having increased concern about their own bodies, like what they can do, what they can't do anymore, how they look, their physical appearance. And what's happening is that at the same time that parents may be having some of these issues, and certainly, again, this doesn't happen to all parents, but when certain parents may have these issues, they are juxtapositioning themselves next to their like burgeoning child, or child who is physically growing, who has young skin and is able to bounce back after injury, or who doesn't have as many medical problems by and large. For some, you might even say, like during adolescence, the most physically attractive. And so you have these adolescents who are going through their own changes, but parents are also potentially going through changes as well. So we have to consider the whole family when we're looking at this disruption to the equilibrium. Some of those midlife changes I was just talking about are more of these biological changes, but parents may also be, thinking about the world differently than they did when they were younger as well. So it's more of a cognitive change. Remember that adolescents begin to be able to think more about the future, what's possible. These are really great things when we're thinking about looking ahead into adulthood. But on the flip side, if we're looking at adults, adults may start to view their lives as more limited. So it's in the opposite direction, that perhaps these possibilities are more limited. They're in their jobs, they're in their relationships. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just reflecting differences in thinking. So, how does this affect the family? Well, we might have this overlap of crises or issues. I don't necessarily even want to use the word crisis. So, as an example, the adolescent might find the mom's attention annoying. Like, I'm independent now, I can do things on myself, I don't need you in the same way that I used to. But mom, this also, you could put dad in here too. More of the research is on moms. We've talked about that already in childhood. But mom sees this independence as the end of her career as a mom. Like, who am I anymore? So it's still a question of identity. So again, both of these issues, both people in a relationship or multiple people in a relationship each have their own things that they're bringing to the table. This doesn't look the same in every family. Um, it might not have happened to you, but hopefully you're able to think about this broadly and how these different issues could be causing some of this disequilibrium within the context of a family. There's been research that has examined the mental health of parents during this period of adolescence. And in some research, it's actually found that this period of adolescence is particularly difficult for parents. And in fact, that this period of adolescence actually takes a bigger toll on parents' mental health than it does on adolescents' mental health. We could talk about why that might be the case, but first, before we do that, in one particular study, this is just one sample, but two-thirds of parents said that adolescence was the most difficult time that they parented. So harder than parenting a newborn, for example, or a toddler that's going through the terrible twos or terrible threes. And they also reported that while parenting an adolescent, this was the lowest point in both their marital satisfaction and their life satisfaction. This is one of those interesting findings that's not encouraging. And when I've shared this with parents of adolescents, it's, well, not that I always do that, but they can really get behind it. And that's partly because adolescents are going through these changes of independence. It's the first time that they're on their own, and so parents are really worried about them. Part of it comes down to these potential conflicts that emerge when adolescents are questioning them when they haven't done so before. A lot of it comes down to worry, although every parent-child relationship is not the same. Mental health is also affected by children moving out. This probably isn't that surprising to many of you, for that your parents expressed these kinds of concerns if you moved away to come to college, for example. And if we were in class, I would have asked you, who do you think feels the greatest loss in terms of a mother or a father? But in this particular research study here, that they found that indeed fathers felt the greatest sense of loss. One of the reasons that they posit that this happens is because um, mothers tend to report staying in communication more with their adolescents. And so fathers often rely on mothers for that information. And so essentially, if they're not having as much contact, let's say by phone call or video chat, then they really are less connected. So think about your dad right now.